So I'm going to start by talking a little bit more about Daoism, or Taoism, the way, literally, or the path. It is the basic principle behind everything in existence. And it regards life as heightened consciousness. So, for Taoists, the world created by men is a prison from which one must escape. It focuses on becoming one with the universe, on being aware of the way life changes, the way things flow, the way in which you have to be part of nature. You don't resist, you adapt to it, which is the path or the way to happiness. So life becomes joy through a heightened consciousness. In order to achieve that heightened consciousness, as Taoism changed from being a philosophy to becoming an institutionalized religion, it began to emphasize the importance of meditation. Just as other religions emphasized prayer, Taoism regards the idea of contemplation in order to understand the environment, to understand our universe, to mediate with nature as being the essential act of a good Taoist. And Taoists also value individuality as above common factors. Now I want to show you how this affected architectural design. We have seen last week how Confucianism became the basis of urban design and design of what was regarded as civilized houses and places. And now we're going to talk about how Taoism affected designers. So here is the first house we looked at in Beijing. And you remember that once you'd entered through the bent entrance from the street, the whole house was symmetrical and axial from north to south, totally symmetrical, surrounded by a high wall, totally ordered, totally in harmony, creating a world where a man could operate and live with respect for his environment and for the others around him in an ordered way. But such a home doesn't have much room for nature. You can see an occasional tree, but it is usually symmetrically or axially planned, placed, so it conforms to Confucian order. Now, in such a house, there is really no room for any sense of nature as we normally experience in all its wildness and chaotic confusion. Quite early on, in this 6th century AD, a Chinese poet is the first person we know who designed a house where you went beyond the Hall of the Ancestors into nature. He called that, or at least we believe he called it that, walking out of the cage. And he wrote a poem with that name. His name was Dao Qin. And he describes in the poem living like a hermit in the marketplace. So in other words, it's an urban house, totally urban, but it has nature as part of it. you notice you don't actually go through or past the shrine of the ancestors. You have to go through the corner courtyards to get into the garden. But still, they are easily accessed. It is easy to go in. And this became very quickly, after the 5th century AD, it became very quickly a common procedure for people who were interested in the idea of an existence which was socially harmonious in the daytime, but allowed you to escape in moments of repose into the world of nature. And they sometimes did that by putting servants' rooms or other activities on the side so as to free up the space at the back of the house. And then the characteristic thing of the garden is that it is not, and like an English garden, it is not nature reproduced. It is symbolic. Everything is miniaturized, so the mountains are often only 5 feet high. And the plants which resemble trees are often very small. And the lake is often quite tiny. It has to be because of the urban condition. And the contrast between water and mountains is still achieved even in this miniaturized way, in this symbolic way. Now, if one could afford to, one would of course expand the house to accommodate more of your family, and that would enable you to subdivide the open space that was left into a series of gardens. But usually only one of these was really a Taoist garden. That is, it was to symbolize the contrast between yin and yang, between the aggressive forces of nature and the passive forces of nature, the yielding forces. The other gardens were often celebrating famous works of art or great poems, which were sometimes engraved on a stone in that particular garden. And so you have a series of walls dividing the garden, and we'll see that more clearly as we go on. And the central or major garden would be a true Taoist garden with all the contrasts necessary to emphasize the drama of nature and the yin and the yang. And then the others, often quite different in character, representing these poems or paintings. And you passed from one garden to another as you passed from the house into the garden through a doorway. And the doorway would cease to be rectangular as it moved into the garden and become either pure circle to represent nature in its simplest way, as a simple symbol, or some aspect of nature. So here's a transition from the rectilinear to the natural. Now, I've said that the gardens were often miniaturized and can be very simple and small. So here is the contrast between yin and yang. We have a low, apparently a sort of representation of water at the low level, and then a mountain. And this mountain is a volcanic mountain, a volcanic core, surrounded by lower mountains with some plants represented by shrubs, and the whole thing is extremely small. For the Chinese, the symbolism is not limited simply to yin and yang, but it's actually multifarious. It's a very complicated symbolism. So here we pass from a pavilion out into a landscape. Here a pavilion looks in 4 directions into the landscapes. In the paintings and drawings, you frequently see the conflict and contrast between the aggressive mountains and the passive water. But that is not purely imaginary. It's not even very exaggerated. because there are regions of China which have such landscapes, or something very close to it. Most famous of all is in the south, south of Canton, the Blue Lake region. But there are several others as well. And they are areas where the sedimentary rocks have been worn away by time, leaving the volcanic cores. And these are the landscapes that are immortalized in Chinese poetry and painting, and in the best of the gardens. And one certainly becomes aware of the violence of nature, the aggressive forces in nature, as well as the passive ones in such a landscape. And then these are the symbolic attempts to reduce it to a miniature scale. The rocks are extraordinarily beautiful in many cases, and perhaps more to Chinese eyes than to ours sometimes. And they symbolize all sorts of things. And these rocks have to last a long time, so they have to be of a very hard material. And so they are actually imported from various parts of China, particularly the Blue Lake region itself, and sold in shops all over China, in cities, which specialize in selling rocks. And if the rock is particularly beautiful, it can be very valuable. To spend a few $1,000s on a rock, on one rock, is nothing in China. And also to bequeath it in your will to particular people or descendants is also common. In some areas where it was easy to do so, and it was possible to have enough land, the house would actually incorporate a lake of considerable size. And there would sometimes be a viewing platform at the back of the hall of the ancestors to allow you to see the garden. Yes?
So a true Taoist garden would want to celebrate the wild...
The contrasts. The contrasts that are truly nature.
Right, so yet everything was miniaturized and placed accordingly in contrast with da-da-da-da. That seems kind of at odds with each other, I guess. Like, why didn't they just plant it and let it go wild? Like, why did it have to be miniaturized?
Because they were celebrating the beauty of the Blue Lake region and of this kind of wild nature in other parts of China, which for them epitomized the forces of nature, the strength and the passivity of nature in contrast all the time, one yielding to the other. And so they couldn't do it with just wild plants. It wouldn't work. But the levels of symbolism are very complicated too, because they involve poetry and painting. And so you're not necessarily symbolizing just yin and yang. You're symbolizing lots of other things, famous lines of poetry and so on, in a miniature way. It's hard for us to perhaps appreciate. I should say, by the way, that the way in which one would appreciate the garden would be to walk through it. The path was carefully designed to take you through experiences. And you would pass through the walls into another garden, and again the path would go on, taking you through an experience. So the first way to experience a Chinese house garden would be to follow the path, and it would take you round and bring you back to the house. But then the garden could be experienced, of course, by meditation. And so pavilions were often built in each of the gardens to allow you a place to meditate, either a platform or a pavilion with a seat. But then you could go further and say that it would be more advantageous for a group of people to experience the garden together than for a single person to experience it alone. And so parties were arranged, particularly among young people growing up. And these parties were assigned to a particular garden, which perhaps was celebrating a poem. And in this garden, the way in which you would experience the garden would be to make up a line of poetry about it, or about something the garden stood for. And then your neighbor would have to follow it with another line of poem. And then the third neighbor would have to follow with another line. Now, if the poem was thought to be degenerating, the lines were not good enough, then the person who composed the wrong line, the bad line, would have to pay a forfeit. That forfeit was often a glass of wine. So a sign of someone who had failed in the afternoon's contemplation might be that they were drunk at the end of the day. So you'll find all of that's quite celebrated in Chinese literature and discussed in, very well described in some Chinese books, particularly the story of the stone. You see some of the lakes are quite large, and you see a pavilion there on the lower one on the right, which is designed to be on the edge of the lake and to allow you to contemplate it. This painting really encapsulates what it's all about. Everything in the man-made world is rectangular and ordered, straight lines. Everything in the natural world is wild as you can get it. And the two are in direct juxtaposition. You can see there one of the doors coming out, which is made into a free form. A problem arose when it came to a man-made bridge. For naturally, the components were usually straight components. And so how did you make it look more natural? Well, the obvious answer would be to avoid it going straight across, but to have a zigzag or some kind of a devious path. Now, this is a very good example of a miniature garden of that kind. And notice how exotic the rocks are and how some of them can be read as other figures. Some of them can be read as birds or wild animals. There's one, clearly a bird. And you also get artificial mountains of considerable size. And this is one in the Imperial City in Beijing. And it's not one of the largest ones by any means. Here's a typical free-form doorway going into a cliff-like grove. See, there's an extraordinarily exotic rock in the background at the top. Now here I've gone to Japan, to a 6th century garden in Japan, and this garden is 10 foot wide and goes around a corner. And here there's no chance of having water, so water is simply represented by sand. And so here you have a stream running through the mountains, and you see the miniaturized trees. And here we're back in the Imperial City in Beijing, and now we have one of the really big mountains. This one is 40 feet high, artificially created out of rocks. It's the retirement villa of one of the most famous emperors in the 18th century. And it has a pavilion on top of the mountain, looking down into his villas. And when you go to the bottom, you're looking at the bottom of the mountain and up towards the pavilion at the top. So how many symbolisms are involved? Well, we have some more we know about. One is that the Taoist garden represents life. And for the Taoists, the mountains are the bones of life. And, of course, the water is the blood flowing through the vessels of life. We know that the Chinese regarded creativity as being a Taoist activity. Conformity was the Confucian activity. So naturally, creative artists and poets tended to be much more committed to Taoism and to the escape into nature than were the government officials and the people who were involved in the order of society in the towns. When it came to the issue of the afterlife, Taoism, in a way, answers that by talking about the wholeness of all experience and all life. Everything in creativity is one. So the life we live now is part of the total existence of which we are part. But this wasn't enough for many people who were living a very hard life, many of the working class. And so they tended to be tempted towards Buddhism, which offered, as you remember, a better afterlife, an escape into a more perfect world in reincarnation. So many Chinese people who were of the privileged classes and were naturally destined to be in government and order would be mainly Confucian, but maybe often they were also Taoists as well. Most creative people were mainly Taoists. Most working class people were favored Buddhism and tended to be more Buddhist. But the result was that in Chinese society, until Maoism, the three religions coexisted, and they were all respected, and it was possible for someone to be an observant of all three. Another interesting thing about Taoism is that you could represent the yin and the yang without plants, and they sometimes did in these miniature gardens, just with sand and stones. The plants were just an addition to represent change and continual growth. So plants were not necessarily as important to a Taoist garden as one would think. Aggression pacified and worn away by time. These very strong contrasting qualities in the landscape. But there isn't a single part of one of these small Taoist gardens that hasn't got symbolic meaning. But the difficulty for Westerners is to reach out to it, and even for modern Chinese. For lots of that symbolism is being lost with time. So what was the Chinese reaction to French formal gardens when they were first brought to China by missionaries? Well, they didn't go down very well. And they were always modified and changed into something much more Chinese. And of course, the English landscape garden was unthinkable. But I think perhaps to summarize, the main point is to notice the contrast between the house and the landscape, no matter how small the landscape was. It could be in a tiny courtyard, only 10 foot wide, but it's the contrast between them that's important. One is essentially Confucianism. It must be ordered, it must be symmetrical. The other is essentially Taoist. It must be contrasting, violent, passive, nothing ordered about it at all. Must be as wild as possible. So the contrast is an essential characteristic. Now this topic is about Confucianism. For the Confucian, the important problem in a society was the natural aggression of many human beings and the need to try and control that and order that natural aggression for the well-being of everybody, to create an environment that was safe and predictably safe and secure. And the basic principle of Confucianism was that it involved subjugating one's individuality in order to achieve the harmony of social order, to respect it in order to find happiness. And so that involved accepting certain principles of mutual respect and mutual sacrifice. Here in this 11th century painting, you see a representation of that ordered world. It is the house of an important official or a nobleman. We see the street on the left and the house on the right. We see the ladies of the house receiving visitors on the right. And the visitors have arrived in the street on horseback and in carriages, and they're passing through the entrance doors. Flanking the entrance door are seats, and on those seats are sitting the guards, whose job it is just to maintain order. The whole thing is geometrical, axial, symmetrical, extremely civilized. Now, if you extend that principle, then you can find countless houses everywhere in Japan that have the same basic arrangement. They will only have an absolutely central entrance if the people are not terribly worried about traditional superstitions. If they are, they will start to have a bent entrance like the ones at the bottom left. Otherwise, they will be symmetrical. What this means when you come to the urban scale is quite surprising. You start to get an enormous number of parallel sites with parallel axes, so that it becomes true to say that in a typical urban environment, all the buildings face south and turn their back to the north. And they're all parallel to each other. On a large scale then, as I showed you once before, you can have a town in which, because most of the people in the town are related to each other, and so it's in a way a great extended family or a clan, the town has an entrance hall inside the front gate. And then the courtyard becomes a cross street, and you go through a reception hall for the ruler of the town, and that ruler of the town actually acts as the guardian of the shrine of the ancestors for the whole town. So his main room at the top center of the plan is a room for not only for entertaining, but with the hall of the ancestors in it for the whole town. Even if not all the members of the town are related to each other, something similar remains. So many of the traditional towns of of China and Japan later on, but China, had entrance halls like this. And then you went from the entrance hall into the streets, and there were cross streets, all the houses tending to face due south, and you go up the main street to a temple at the end, which is a shrine for the community of the village, of the town. And it's a shrine for the respect to their ancestors. The whole complex is walled, and in this case, and if it's freestanding in the countryside, it will have towers for defense against attack. Now, the curious thing is that this same pattern was used in the layout of cities. That is to say, here is a huge city. The south wall from left to right is more than 5 miles long. So that is 5 miles, giving you an idea of the scale of it. That is 1.5 miles, and that's the royal city. And here is the main city approach on the axis to the royal city, and through the royal city to the garden of the royal city at the back, with a screen wall against the north. This is, in fact, as you can see, a plan of Chang'an, the great capital of the Tang dynasty. It's to the west of Beijing today. Now, what is intriguing about it is that the streets, which are obviously rectilinear and transverse and vertical, these streets contain very large blocks. And the plan of the block traditionally, was the same as the plan of one of those towns. That is to say, if you took an individual block, except for the corner towers, its plan would be like that. It was completely surrounded by walls. It had a single entrance on the south side, and then it had cross streets inside the block. And around each block was a high wall. And that was how order was maintained in the city. There were, in addition, 2 markets, number 5 and number 7 there, as well as, of course, a huge number of temples of the 3 faiths and a number of recreational areas. This city was abandoned in the 9th century AD, effectively. And then its ruins were reoccupied in the 13th century and made into a capital in the 14th century. But of course, it was far too big to be the new capital in the 14th century. So they confined themselves to reoccupying the imperial city area. And that is the modern city of Xi'an. But what it meant was that as they reoccupied it, they repaired the walls. And so we still have the wall of the Imperial Tang Dynasty city still standing. And there it is. This is that wall that was 1.5 miles long along the south side of the imperial city. It is about 50 feet wide at the top, which was wide enough for 2 chariots to pass at full speed in opposite directions along the top. And of course, the superstructure of the wall would have been in wood. All the balusters for defensive protection against the arrow of the warriors who were using arrows. All of that has been taken away by time, and we only have just the stonework and the brickwork left. Here's a cross section through it. You get an idea of how wide it is at the top. In the center of modern Xi'an is a new feature. In the exact center, it is a bell tower, or a gong tower, and that was to sound a warning at night and in the early morning for a curfew. That was all part of maintaining order. So after 8 o'clock in the evening, or before 6 o'clock in the morning, nobody could move without the possibility of them being apprehended by police and cross-examined and perhaps arrested. That was a new feature. From the bell tower, looking at the gate. The gate has a superstructure which is a modern one, that it was made in the 14th century. The original Tang superstructure had decayed and was made of wood. Now, by the time that the town was redeveloped as a capital in the 14th century, the view about the privacy of the blocks had changed. You may remember in the video I showed you at the end of the last lecture of the life in Kaifeng in the early 12th century, the beginning of the 12th century, that there was so much innovative enterprise going on, people manufacturing objects and selling them in the street in order to make a living because of the lack of opportunities for employment. This new enterprise in China meant that cities changed their character and became places for business. And so they began to have shops. As well as stalls, they began to have shops. The streets were still often lined with trees, and they were often controlled very strictly. But you not only began to have shops, but you began to have houses above the shops, and also houses approached directly from the street and not from within a block. So this is what what Chang'an streets would have been like. And this is taken from the modern imperial city of Beijing. And this is what the streets became in Xi'an because of this need for private enterprise and this breaking down of the tradition of having completely enclosed blocks in which everything, all activities took place inside enclosures. So now you begin to have not only shops but also the houses opening directly into the streets. And you remember that we saw that in Beijing too, because Beijing was recreated. It had been a provincial capital, a small one, but it became much more important in the 16th century as the capital was moved from Xi'an to Beijing. And so Beijing takes on the same sort of form. You tend to get the houses opening directly into the streets and not into the internal streets of the blocks, as they had done in Chang'an. So we're back in Xi'an now. Typical Xi'an street. And of course, a house, I've shown you it before. Typical Xi'an house. Inside the courtyard. What people don't often realize, though, is that Chinese temples tended to be treated the same way. They tended to be entered through a single doorway from the street, often not a very elaborate doorway, quite modest. And then you would go in through the doorway and be in the courtyard of the temple. And the temples would tend to look very alike. You would have to find out whether it was a Taoist temple or a Confucian temple or a Buddhist temple because they were so alike. We are lucky because in Beijing we do have photographs from the 1860s. So we get a sense of what Beijing was like before it was at all modernized. And here you see the corner tower of Beijing and the camel trail arriving. And here is the great gateway through the doorway. Now, the gateways of Xi'an, when they were rebuilt, were like this, and we think that probably they were in ancient Chang'an too. That is, they tended to be solid masonry for defensive purposes below, but everything at the upper level was in wood. And of course, what happened at the upper level was you had all the barrack rooms and the community rooms for the soldiers who were in charge of guarding the gate, and perhaps for customs officers as well. Wonderful gateway, isn't it? Now, Beijing was extended, and so we have the second phase of the city on the south side, with an extra wall. We have the imperial city in the center of the upper town and the other city, and then the extension at the south. Beijing was unusual in that the imperial city had a Tang garden on one side of it, which had not happened before. Number 2 in that plan. It also had an artificial mountain at the back to protect the imperial family from the north. And here we are in the main street as it was. And here's the aerial view today. And here in an old photograph, the wall of the imperial city. And a plan of it. Now the imperial city, not surprisingly, has 3 entrance gateways, one behind the other, 1, 2, 3. And then you go through into the inner sanctum, as it were, the main audience area for the emperor, and you go through a small open gateway there to the main hall of the emperor, where the audiences took place. And then there was a hall behind for the reception of ambassadors, and a hall used for private audiences and for robing. And then behind that, surrounded by its own ditch, and you notice there's a water ditch around the whole imperial city, and then there's another water ditch around this area, and this is the Imperial Palace private quarters for the family, and their main house was there with private houses behind it. Then there's a screen wall at the back to keep out the spirits, a shadow wall, and then behind is the mountain, the artificial mountain at the top. Here you see the inner part, the moat surrounding, sorry, that's wrong. The moat surrounding the main palace is there. Here's the third of the great gateways. It's a U shape. And then you go into the entrance courtyard and through the entrance portal to the courtyard of the audience hall, which is there. These flanking areas are flanking from officials, some of whom lived on the site and some of whom had their main offices on the site. So all the members of the cabinet and the important members of the imperial family lived on the site as well, as together with the concubines of the emperors who lived here. And here's the sacred mountain at the back of the site. Seeing the same thing from above. And of course we have three gateways. You see them there. 1, 2, 3. And then in front of them we have Tiananmen Square. Now Tiananmen Square was not an original feature of the city, but one which was developed in the 19th century. And at the back here you see the sacred mountain, the protective mountain from the north. So here are the gateways, and then 5 bridges across from Tiananmen Square, across the outer moat to the first gateway. And you see the 5 bridges at the bottom here, and the first of the great gateways. And the whole axial sequence of progression through here. An amazingly immense palace enclosure. And here is during Maoist times, my photograph of the outer gateway and the view along the axis to the other gateways.
Can I ask why 3, why 5?
Number symbolism was tremendously important for them. So they're looking at numbers which interrelate and are therefore magically beneficial, but also numbers which relate to the seasons and to the days of the year and the days of the month and so on. Very elaborate, symbolism. I hope you've noticed that just as in the house, the end of the axis from south to north was the hall of the ancestors, and at the inside the hall of the ancestors, the shrine of the ancestors. The same is true of the plan of the city. There's a central axis going from the south gate. You pass through into and in the center of the north side is the imperial city, the forbidden city. And you go along the axis of that from south to north, and you come to the hall of audience, which is called in Beijing the Hall of Supreme Harmony, emphasizing the harmony of the ordered city of the Confucian world. And then you go beyond that to the home of the emperor, and that becomes the center of all respect and devotion in China, in imperial China. Now we're at the south gate of the imperial city. It has great wings, which of course are barracks for soldiers and guards. And then you go through and come to the inner gate, and you go through that again. Oh, sorry, this is still the outer gate. I do apologize. But it's the inside of the outer gate, out of order. And this is one of the inner gates. We pass through into the entrance area of the inner palace, and it has this amazing meandering stream, a sort of touch of Taoism in the hall at the approach to the Imperial Audience Chamber. And then you go through to the Imperial Hall itself, up a great flight of steps. And this is some of the side halls. And here we're looking through the gateway at the Imperial Audience Hall, going up the flights of steps and inside it. And here is the throne on the left of the emperor. Beyond that, the Hall of the Ambassadors, in which private audiences took place, and on the right-hand side of it, the Hall of Robing and the private audience hall of the emperor. And the wall behind that is the enclosing wall of the emperor's abode. Here we're looking sideways to get an idea of the side axes. And here we are close up. Now we've gone behind the halls of residence to the shadow wall. You can see it through the opening here, which is on the north side. Here we are going alongside it. And you see the three-roofed pavilion on top of the mountain, which shields the whole complex from the north. Now this is one of the side houses, one of the dozens of side houses. So this is what they would look like. This is the red is the imperial color, red and gold together. And this is the home of the chief concubine. And we're going inside it, gilt everywhere, and the house itself. And the gateway to the house, and the interior of the throne of the chief concubine. So another of these side streets at right angles to the main Imperial Palace. And at the back, going through the shadow wall, the artificial hill at the back to protect the whole complex from the north. And climbing up that hill. Now, on the south side of the city is another series of complexes. It looks like that. Now, this was originally outside the first city of Beijing, on the south side, and it was a series of temples devoted to bringing in the new year and welcoming the harvest, and giving a good omen to a harvest. So these are called the Temple of Heaven. And there's an open-air altar of heaven and a temple of heaven behind it, and at the back a temple of benign harvests. Here is the open-air altar of heaven on which the emperor would welcome the new year. And you can see the same photograph at the bottom in black and white, and above it on a photograph from the air of the Temple of Heaven. Now, you understand that they are both circular for a specific reason, because we're dealing now with the heavens, with cosmology, with nature and the universe. We're not dealing with man-made things at all. But what is very interesting is the symbolism of it. And I won't attempt to explain it to you, but you can look it up in books if you wish. It is an amazingly complex symbolism involving the number of days in the month, 28, the number of hours in the day, 12, or 24. And 24 is significant because they would double the 12. And, of course, the number of seasons in the year, 4. And so it would go on. And it's an extraordinarily elaborate number system involved in the layout of not only the altar of heaven here, but the temple of heaven and the temple of the harvest as well. Giving you some idea how elaborate the symbolism must have been in traditional China. Here we are on the actual top of the altar of the platform of heaven, and the very center where the emperor would welcome the new year. And looking down at the gates. And here is the temple to welcome the harvest. Again circular, because you're dealing with nature. Marvelous buildings, aren't they? And the temple of heaven. Now all of that, of course, is from the 15th and 16th centuries. But we can go much further back. And so I'm looking here in Japan at what the architecture must have been like at the beginning of the Tang Dynasty in the 6th century AD and the 7th century. Very carefully maintained by the Japanese and repaired and reconstructed all the time. The only alteration that we believe we can detect is that the pitched roof seems to be higher in Japan than it is in China, suggesting that the design was modified with time, which the Japanese themselves accept. But basically the simplicity of it is a very good indication of the origins of the institutional architecture of the three religions. So this is a Buddhist monastery in Japan, the entrance gate, looking at the main hall beyond the entrance gate. Notice the beautiful geometry and the tremendous simplicity of it. And there's the great hall itself. Anyway, you get a sense of the architecture, how pure and simple it was in the early days, and how it tended to become elaborate and inevitably with time as it became more institutionalized. Well, what I have missed out, because I was hoping Pedro would be here and I'd be able to include it, is the architecture of Korea. Not surprisingly, Korea is influenced by both cultures, by the Chinese and the Japanese, but the Chinese predominated. And Korea obviously was influenced by Chinese architecture at a very early period and by Chinese culture at a very early period. So Korean architecture is much simpler, as simple as this Buddhist temple in Japan, and also much more aware of the mystical traditions of orientation and sighting. So Feng Shui was tremendously important in Korea, even more important than in China, as was Taoism, very dominant in Korea, a major influence. Buddhism, by contrast, not so important in Korea. So I'll show you the Korean buildings at the beginning of the next lecture. Any questions? Yes?
In the last image, there was a lantern in the walkway
Yes.
to the temple. I presume that's deliberate. Is that correct?
I'm sure it's deliberate, yes. But why it would be deliberate, I don't know. Perhaps somebody else does know. Anybody know? Why would a lantern be placed on the axis in a Japanese Buddhist temple? I should say, perhaps just to conclude, a word about Chinese Buddhism. It's very different from Indian Buddhism or Sri Lankan Buddhism or Burmese Buddhism. And the difference is that those Buddhists all believed that you could achieve a better life after death through reincarnation. The Chinese modified that to accept that one could reach enlightenment through meditation, taking over ideas from Taoism, so that actually Chinese Buddhism and Taoism are not too different. They both believe that meditation of the world and of oneself is the way to happiness and to enlightenment. And so profound meditation is much more essential in Chinese Buddhism than it is in Indian or Burmese or Sri Lankan Buddhism. So there's a definite difference. Any other questions? Right, well, we'll pick them up in the tutorial perhaps.